Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Dr. Danny Gordon. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm just seeing people coming into the room now. And I'm just going to say hi to Hannah, who's a GP and a menopause specialist, and to Charlotte, who is a recent medical school graduate in the UK doing her foundational training. And we have Sharon, and we also have Dominic. So thank you guys for coming. I'm just going to wait a few more minutes for everyone to arrive, see who wants to join us. And welcome to everyone else that I can see on my little eye up here, but I haven't chatted with in the comments yet. So this is the first webinar I'm going to be doing in conjunction with Drug Science. Drug Science is a wonderful nonprofit, and they focus on drug education. And they're also running a fantastic nonprofit project called Project 2021, which aims to be and it will be, the largest real-world data collection for medical cannabis patients worldwide. And that program is starting pretty much imminently. And it's run by one of my fantastic colleagues, Dr. Chloe Sakal, who's a psychiatrist here in the UK, and she's the clinical lead for Project 2021 in Drug Science. So I'm going to be doing a series of these webinars for clinicians and physicians and even nurse practitioners, anyone who is prescribing medical cannabis or involved with medical cannabis care for patients over the next few months. So every month we'll address a new topic. We'll do some lectures, some slides. I'll do a few slides around the topic we're going to be talking about. And then I'm just going to open it up to the Q&A. I just really want it to be interactive. I've already got some questions that I'm going to be answering in the sidebar here. And really the whole point of these is for me to be able to share my clinical knowledge of practicing cannabis medicine in Canada, treating thousands of patients over a wide variety of conditions with the clinical community, and have it open, accessible, and free for everyone. So today we're going to focus on anxiety and mental health, but if you have burning questions about other topics you want to hear, please leave me a comment and we'll address them in a future webinar. And then we will have time for a big Q&A, and we'll aim to finish around 6:45. Okay, so I'm just going to get started now and go to the slides. Okay, so because this is the first one, I'm just going to do a short introduction about medical cannabis more generally. And then we're going to move into talking about anxiety. And I'm also going to touch on insomnia, PTSD, and medical cannabis for mental health. Now, if a lot of these topics get burning questions that are not directly related to anxiety, then we can do a follow-up series on that particular topic. So if I'm getting a lot of questions on PTSD or depression, or if people feel they didn't get enough information on insomnia, for example, we can do the next one on that. Here we go. Still learning about these slides. So medical cannabis has been used for thousands of years medicinally in many old world cultures, including ancient India. The Egyptians used it, the ancient Sumerians. And in India, it's still used today. I've spent a lot of time in India doing meditation courses and so forth. And it's something that's still used in some spiritual traditions there. And certainly it used to be an ingredient for many of the medicinal Indian medicine, Ayurvedic medicine compounds, although technically it is still illegal in India today. So it has a long history. In the 1800s, in the Victorian era, despite the what people think of Victorians about being quite straight-laced, they actually considered cannabis tinctures a respectable botanical medicine. It was sold in pharmacies alongside drugs and other recipes at the time. And there's a few different sources in the 1800s that we can really go back in the historical texts and see that they were probably using it for things like melancholia, as I called it back then, or neuroses, anxiety, and for insomnia. And I'm just going to try to acknowledge the comments as I go along. This is new to me, so I appreciate if I'm not flowing as smoothly in between. So I'm just going to say hi, Mary, and hi, Diddy. When are you contacting patients for 2021? That's a really great question. So Chloe, Dr. Sakala is the clinical lead, and you can go to the Drug Science website to Project 2021 page, and you can find out all about that information there. And I'm just going to respond to another one as we go. Yes, Eduardo, we will be talking about CBD as well as medical cannabis today in the context of anxiety. Thank you for asking about that. And just some people sharing that they've also been using medical cannabis for many, many years. And Charlotte, who's a GP, she's actually doing her foundational year as a GP trainee here in the UK. She's saying that she's already getting patients asking for medical cannabis prescriptions, but currently only specialists can prescribe. She's, of course, in a GP training role in this instance here in the UK. So Charlotte, right now, GPs can prescribe follow-up in a shared care agreement with a specialist for medical cannabis in the UK. But a specialist must initiate that prescription, that first prescription. In other places, if you're listening in from North America, from South America, and many places where medical cannabis is now legalized, like Colombia. My colleague, Dr. Sandra, is over there doing amazing work. She's also a GP. In Canada, I'm trained as a GP myself, as well as an integrated medicine specialist in the US. So many other places where medical cannabis is legal, GPs can prescribe fully, but in the UK, not yet. And hi, David. Thank you for joining us from Ontario, Canada. And he is just saying very correctly that in Canada, where I've been practicing before moving back to the UK, yes, we have doctors and nurse practitioners that can authorize. And that is, I think, really progressive about Canada. So nurse practitioners, I speak to a lot of nurse practitioners on social media and on LinkedIn who are prescribing medical cannabis in North America, and they're fantastic colleagues. So we hope eventually we can get some of this happening in the UK too. Okay, back to the slides. So I'm just going to kind of go through these ones pretty quickly. Just some historical context. When I first started prescribing medical cannabis, I really didn't know much about its history, only really in the sense that we were taught in medical school how dangerous it was. It was a drug of no medicinal value. We were taught nothing about the endocannabinoid system. So when I started really researching and going back and looking at the history of how it's been demonized post-prohibition in the US, for example, it was really shocking to me. And this was a very famous now propaganda piece that was produced called Reefer Madness. And it was a movie that depicted people being sent into a murderous rage from smoking cannabis. And it was a very racist campaign. It was a very biased campaign made to really demonize cannabis as a substance. And then in 1944, the New York Academy of Medicine actually did an extensive review of cannabis to see if it did match up with these claims that Reefer Madness had made and the government at the time was making about cannabis, about its very high risk of harm. And they found that actually it didn't make people in large droves go insane and go on murdering. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of move forward past this a little bit. But basically, at the time, in the early part of the 20th century, we have a move into the Prohibition era. Medical cannabis is beginning to be struck from pharmacopoeias, and it's no longer considered a respectable medicine. In the UK, this happened in 1971. It was struck as a medication from the UK pharmacopoeia. And then it fell into disrepute and was a drug of no medicinal value until 2018. And okay, there we go. I'm just going to fixing the screen again. So when we learned in medical school that medical cannabis, or just the cannabis plant in general, was of no medicinal value, part of this misconception was because we were never taught that we have our own system called the endocannabinoid system that's in charge of homeostasis in the brain and the body. And this homeostatic system is involved with regulating everything from immune function, reproductive function, our appetites, pain and pleasure, response to stress and pain, trauma response. It really interacts with our mood systems, so our serotonin systems, our GABAergic systems. And it also is in charge of things like neuroprotection, involved with memory and cognition, new learning, and it even is involved in circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythm disruptions, we think now are also have an endocannabinoid system component. And endocannabinoids are also, and endocannabinoid receptors are also prevalent in our digestive tract. So this is really why medical cannabis seems to work for so many things, because there's receptors for phytocannabinoids and endocannabinoids in almost every organ system, including in our bone marrow, throughout the female reproductive tract and the gut, and of course, throughout certain parts of the brain. So without getting into too much detail, and some of you I'm sure already know most of this, oh, and actually, Dominic just asked a great question. Why is the endocannabinoid system not covered in medical training? Well, it's a great question. There is a lag. There's a huge lag. We've known about it for 30 years, and just now medical schools, some medical schools are starting to introduce it into their curriculum. So drug science actually has produced an amazing slide deck that's being introduced into some curriculums now about the endocannabinoid system. I've done some guest lecturing as well at some of the universities around this on some of the postgraduate programs. So it is happening, but it's slow. It's slow on the uptake, and we hope that with more education, it will change. All right. So we know that THC likes to prefer what's called the CB1 receptor, which is most prevalent, although it's in immune system cells and gut cells and all kinds of places. But we have a really large proportion of CB1 receptors that can bind to THC most readily in the brain. And CBD, on the other hand, which is the other very well-known cannabinoid, and what's in all these hemp products over the counter, it doesn't bind preferentially or strongly to either the CB1 or the CB2 receptor. It's more of a modulator of the entire system, we think, through second messengers, through something called orphan receptors. And that's something we're really still learning about CBD, how all of the pathways it affects in the brain, in the body. And I just had another really good question. What do mainstream doctors in the UK really think about CBD? Do you get a lot of pushback? Well, I think many doctors in the UK are very open to their patients using CBD, but they don't really understand how to counsel their patients. And it's very tricky because hemp CBD is a supplement, so it's not a medication. So it's very tricky for someone with a medical license to give recommendations in something that is not prescribed as a medicine. And there's many different forms and companies and brands of CBD, but I think in general, they're very open to it. And of course, there's medical cannabis products on prescription that are very high in CBD and very low in THC that can be prescribed as a prescription. And those are I would say, very much preferred for many physicians for indications like anxiety, for example. So I would say that more and more doctors are becoming open to CBD and to medicinal cannabis, thankfully. Okay, I'm just going to check the time. I'm just going to speed things along here. I always get asked about what's the difference between sativas and indicas. Well, it's really not a correct question anymore, because everyone's kind of married their cousins in cannabis genetics world over the last 30 years. There's no longer true sativas or true indicas, really, per se. And it's more what's called chemotypes now. So you can no longer tell by looking at a plant the effect it might have on someone, whether it's going to be more so-called uplifting or energizing or so-called calming. And basically, because of this, there's been a lot of confusion around what products might be best for what type of day, this kind of thing. And also, to complicate matters further, many medical cannabis products, especially we're finding in the UK, don't record things like the terpene profile, minor cannabinoid profile on the bottle. So really, you're just going on CBD and THC content, not on the other plant cannabinoids. You don't really get that choice. Versus in Canada, I had more choice, and there's a lot of times I was choosing specific products that had dominant terpene profiles or other minor cannabinoids that might be beneficial. although we know a lot less about them clinically. There's a lot of preclinical evidence that we can use to guide us. And clinically over the years, I just started to really experiment. So what happens when we have raw cannabis is we have what's called the acidic forms. And these are all made from the mother, basically the mother chemical, which is CBGA, which goes into CBG and then all these other ones. THCA is a raw form of THC. It does not make you high. You can put cannabis leaves in bud through a juicer and you will get a high THC extract, which is a very good antioxidant. It also has anti-epileptic properties and many other medicinal properties, but it's an unstable molecule generally, although there are some companies and some processes that are starting to stabilize this compound. So we can use it medicinally. Then we come into when you heat the plant, the THCA turns into THC, which we all know. And then you get CBD from the CBDA. And then you get some of these breakdown products over time from exposure to oxygen and light and heat, like CBN is one that people might have heard of that some people find can be quite sedating and calming and also sometimes good for pain. Okay. So CBD has a lot of different effects in the brain and the body, and there's still not a ton of RCT evidence in humans for some of these things directly, meaning, in an RCT looking at a placebo-controlled trial. But certainly in the animal models, the preclinical models, we know that it exhibits all of these properties. And it's because it's very kind of low risk and low side effect profile that's the main base for most medicinal cannabinoid therapies. Used as an oral oil or capsules, sometimes vaporized in a flower that's very low THC, high CBD. And I have found that it can reduce THC intoxication, tachycardia side effects when you combine it. So I never say never, but I very, very rarely, if ever, trying to think if I ever have, given someone only high THC products on their medical cannabis plan. I don't think I have, actually. No, definitely not. I had to really think about that to make sure. But it also has, of course, antipsychotic properties, at least in some early research, but it's very, very promising at high doses, 600 to 800 milligrams per dose for those effects. Anxiolytic properties, for which the dosage can vary, and anti-epilepsy properties, and again, usually at quite high doses in the hundreds of milligrams per dose. CBD is also what I call an adaptogen. So when I'm wearing my other hat as an integrated medicine specialist, and I'm also trained in integrated medicine, which is natural evidence-based medicine. And a lot of that training involves botanical medicine. So as a botanical medicine expert, I really look at more than the single compound of CBD and THC. And I also look at CBD even in itself as an adaptogen. In herbal medicine, we have these things called adaptogens, which we don't really have in Western medicine. And these are basically herbals that are known traditionally to help us adapt to chronic stress. And a lot of the preclinical evidence is showing that actually they do impact our immune system in a positive fashion, inflammatory pathways, the adrenal stress hormone response, and work on the hypothalamus. Ginseng's another one, ashwagandha is another one, which is an Indian herb. So in order to be an adaptogen, something must be non-toxic and help with the stress adaptation response. And CBD qualifies. THC has many medicinal properties, but of course, if you take too much of it or you're naive to cannabis, it can certainly make you feel high and dysphoric, and it can be quite unpleasant for many people. It can be anxiolytic at small doses, usually in combination with high CBD. But I have had a lot of patients who are overusing THC, and it's really having the opposite effect on their anxiety disorder. So I'm going to talk about how to deal with those types of cases if you are prescribing, because you're probably going to run into them. Oh, and I just had another comment from David. Thank you. So he says, the Journal of Neuroscience demonstrates that a chemical plant of marijuana called CBD affects the brain in a way that makes it an ideal treatment option for schizophrenia. for schizophrenia. Yes, so there are quite a few small trials in humans actually, comparing different antipsychotics to single doses of CBD and looking at the MRI effects in different areas of the brain associated with psychosis, and also clinical effects. And they're very, very promising. And cannabinoids might even be useful in reducing antipsychotic medication side effects. So this is a really exciting area of cannabinoid medicine. And the other thing I'll say about that is patients with schizophrenia, although of course I would never recommend or prescribe someone THC products if they have schizophrenia, but it's a really complex relationship. If someone already has schizophrenia, there are some population level data that we're getting and some early petri dish work from one of my colleagues at Cambridge showing that for some people with psychosis, chronic psychosis, THC may be working in a way that might be beneficial to some of the side effects they're experiencing from their other medications. And there's differences in the way that different people process THC in the brain based on the way that it binds to a type of serotonin heteromer. So it's actually quite more complicated than we thought. Certainly, I have heard about patients and from colleagues and my psychiatrist colleagues, patients who have chronic schizophrenia, and they're on antipsychotics, they're quite stable, and they manage the side effects of their antipsychotics with cannabis, not under medical supervision usually. So it's really an interesting area. Okay, I'm just going to move forward. So in the UK, we don't have a lot of this choice yet in the products we can get medicinally here as far as the terpene profiles listed on the labels of the products, which might be dominant in which terpenes. But certainly terpenes, we think, are active, at least some of them in the brain. And they're generally thought to have properties that affected the strain effect of a particular cannabis product, especially when it's a dried herbal product, like a cannabis flower, for example, which I have prescribed medicinally in Canada, that you pack into a dried herbal vaporizer. So if I'm prescribing a dried cannabis strain, which I do sometimes on top of oral cannabinoids, then I usually like to choose a strain based on things like cannabinoid profile and terpenoid profile, because it does tend to have a different effect, and patients will, have, really confirmed this over the years. So it's really clinical evidence versus RCT evidence for this effect. But treating many patients, I really have found it to be true. Okay. Terpenes over time are lost because they're very volatile. They evaporate and you lose them. Okay, I'm just going to go through this quickly. But most of us in the UK and prescribing cannabis generally in Europe will be using oral products, so cannabis oils or capsules for the mainstay of therapy. In North America, of course, I never recommend smoking, but sometimes we would be using dried herbal products in a vaporizer. That might happen more and more here in the UK and Europe, but so far we've seen a preference towards oral products. And this is me at a CBD dinner party here in London. I guess the take home here is that lay people are using CBD themselves for anxiety in the droves. And at this dinner party in particular, there was a professional chef, and the menu, I calculated it roughly for each person who had each course. And it was about 60 milligrams of CBD overall for all the courses for each person. And there's a few people drinking some wine, but a lot of people just had the CBD, and they claimed afterwards that they felt more relaxed. Hard to say how much was placebo for some people, but certainly 60 milligrams of CBD dose would have that effect on many people, if not most. So it's just an interesting kind of anecdote that this is not just something people are asking about in their doctor's office. They're going out and they're buying these hemp CBD based products. They're trying it themselves, and consumers are really loving the anti-stress effects, as they would call it, of CBD. And we know these are biologically based. There's evidence for these effects. So it's not a placebo. So cannabis and anxiety. We're finally getting to the meat of it here. If you have the choice, these are some calming terpenes that you might want to choose if you have the choice on a product. I really try to avoid high THC for people who have anxiety, especially inhaled THC, because I find it can make their anxiety worse. So start with a high CBD product, and you can start in an oil. And then I have patients, many patients, who have a mix of anxiety and depression symptoms, because as we all know, I get a lot of complex disease patients and complex care patients. So I very rarely will have someone come to me, referred to me for pure anxiety and nothing else is wrong with them. Usually it's they have anxiety, they have a chronic pain syndrome, they have trouble sleeping, they might have menopausal symptoms if they're a woman. And going through that stage, they also might have PTSD or, some symptom criteria, PTSD, if they don't meet the full criteria. So, and another one is very common is depression. So when I have patients with mixed depression, or they're mostly depressed, their depression scales are high, but they have some degree of anxiety. Sometimes if they're having trouble getting going in the morning and activating, and they've already tried a lot of other medications and non-drug approaches, which I'm very big on. I don't think cannabis should be used in isolation for any of these things, especially in mental health. But sometimes I will prescribe them a small amount of vaporized cannabis to kind of help them get going in the morning. And that small amount of vaporized cannabis in this are the strains that usually contain some THC, because I do find the THC for certain people really makes a difference. And when I first started prescribing medical cannabis, I was really wary of this, but my patients actually started confessing that they were already doing this using black market cannabis. This is before cannabis was legalized in Canada. And I got really curious. And I certainly had patients say to me, when I have the right amount of THC, I feel normal. I don't feel high. And if someone is depressed, we know that, the chemical milieu, their neurochemical balance is probably not the same. Their brain is not activating in the same way as someone who's not depressed. We can see this on neuroimaging studies, MRI studies, EEG studies, which have done a lot of work with EEG. So it might be that likely that THC is activating some of those potentially normalizing networks. So it's something that can be gently experimented with in a very controlled fashion with patients who don't have risk factors for THC use, like history of mania, psychosis, that kind of thing. And it can be very, very helpful for people to use it as a PRN, as an ad-needed medication. So a lot of my patients don't need to take this every day. But when they're having a bad day and just taking a little bit of vaporized cannabis, as long as they don't have to drive right afterwards, they're not having a safety sensitive job, it's really, really helpful. And I have many patients who it's the only thing that's really worked for them. They've tried everything else. So I think that's just really important to mention. And I've just had another question. Okay. I was very skeptical at CBD, but after trying it, I found I got even slightly mellowed for sure, which wish it wasn't so expensive. So CBD is coming down in price. There's, of course, lots of different products out there. So hopefully the price will come down. And certainly for medical cannabis, the price is coming down, but it is slower than we would like. And so far it's not available on the NHS, which is very unfortunate, but hopefully we will get there. Okay. Oh, and I just saw that Lily has joined us. Hi, Lily. I'm so glad that you're here. So Dr. Lily Galindo is a professor at Cambridge University. She's a psychiatrist, and she specializes in cannabinoid therapy and research. And she says that her research I was mentioning earlier about schizophrenia and THC use and cannabis use, it's going to be published in the next edition of the journal entitled Schizophrenia, the Schizophrenia Bulletin. So Lily, I can't wait to read it. We've been chatting back and forth about this. It's really going to be groundbreaking, this piece of research, when it comes out. So I will work on how to get a link out there to everyone if you're interested in reading Dr. Lily's research. And I just have another person who just came on. Just catching up on all these great messages. Thanks, guys. This is really great to have everyone involved. Mary says, hi, Mary. Purified CBD is generally used in the pilot studies for anxiety. what do you use with patients, whole plant or pure CBD? That is a great question. So in my medical practice in Canada, we were using high CBD, low THC medical cannabis. So still products that generally contained between 0.5 and 1% THC. If we, that's what we were calling a CBD oil before we had access to these hemp oils in Canada. I've never used CBD isolate with a patient ever. I've used hemp-based CBD products on my wellness side. I also do a lot of wellness consulting, corporate stress consulting, that kind of thing. So I have used things on the hemp side, but it's been a full spectrum or broad spectrum extract, not the CBD isolate. And you're exactly right. The studies usually use CBD isolate, and they're usually in doses around 600 milligrams for a dose. So 600 milligrams is a huge dose of CBD. But I do find at much, much lower doses, like below 100 milligrams, when you use a broad spectrum or full spectrum product, that people tend to get at least some response, sometimes as low as 10, 15 milligrams. The other thing to say about that is the oral products are generally pretty low absorption, 6 to 10% absorption. I say absorption rather than bioavailability because the bioavailability is slightly different, the way they calculate it. But generally speaking, you can think of them as equivalent for all intents and purposes. So we are seeing some products coming out now that have kind of higher tech delivery systems, enhanced availability systems, different modes of delivery of getting CBD into the system that kind of bypasses the GI tract, so you're getting more. So that is going to affect the doses as well. So far these doses are for oral products without a high tech vehicle. And Mary says, do I see a difference between broad and full spectrum products on anxiety? It's hard to say because, again, I usually, with my medical patients, I'm using medical cannabis, which is full spectrum. Critics who oppose the uses from David. Critics who oppose the use of cannabis over benzodiazepines point to a lack of evidence for cannabis use. Still, when you look at the research, cannabis is a much better evidence-based treatment. And that brings us to a great question. People always ask me, I get a lot of questions from psychiatrists, colleagues, what I do with patients on benzodiazepines. Is it beneficial for them to try converting to medical cannabis to get off of benzodiazepines? So, of course, blanket questions are always tricky for doctors to answer. But, in general, I find patients on long-term benzodiazepine therapy, daily therapy, are often not that well managed, even though they're taking pretty good doses of it. I have patients who were taking multiple doses of benzodiazepines during the daytime for anxiety, and then for sleep, they were taking a longer acting one, and they just wanted to get off of them. So you can't come off of these things cold turkey because they're very habituating medications. So usually we would do a really, really slow wean over a number of months, and we would use high CBD, very, very low THC medicinal cannabis for daytime, and to help with their insomnia and coming off medications and weaning, a very, very small amount of a THC-based oil at nighttime. And I found that to be very effective. And I can honestly say universally, I've probably done that with hundreds of patients now, and for that particular indication. And they, at least my patients who were referred to me for these reasons, also working with their psychiatrist in conjunction with me for their other medications, did find that they much preferred the medicinal cannabis to the benzodiazepines. Okay, I have some other great questions, and then I'm getting told to wrap it up to move on to some more content. And this is from Giuliano. Hi, Giuliano. We are in a medical setting, but I would like to remind that many varieties of legal cannabis hemp are rich in CBD. For example, the Italian Carmagnolia variety, and it makes awesome plants. Absolutely. And the cultivation of high CBD cannabis plants is really taken off. So before, we used to get a really low percentage of cannabinoids in the hemp varieties, but there's been a lot of work in the genetic side to really ramp up the trichomes, like the sticky resin we can get that's high in CBD. So that's a great thing to point out. Hemp can be fantastic too. Andy says, David, can you provide some references to the benzodiazepine CBD comparison studies? I don't know if there are head-to-head studies, Andy. It's a great question. I don't think I've seen those. I have a list actually of, I think almost around 100 anxiety-related medical cannabis studies, CBD studies, which I'll be posting for everyone to see on my blog in July. It's actually part of the reference section of the book that I'm writing. So my publishers have agreed to let me post it free for everyone to see on my blog as soon as the book is released. So I might have some in there. I have to check on that. Okay, I'm just going to move on. And back over here. Okay, I'm just going to click off of this so I can get rid of that bar. Okay. Cannabis and sleep. This is another really common question. Of course, people who have anxiety, a large proportion of them have sleeping problems. They have either problems getting to sleep or maintaining their sleep with fragmentation during the nighttime. There's many different reasons for this, of course. Some people have trouble because of a primary sleep disorder. Some people, it's largely genetic. A lot of it's stress-driven. It can be caffeine-related. So, of course, we want to try those other things first. I once had a patient referred to me for quote unquote intractable insomnia, but when we really dug in, I mean, I do a full integrated medicine intake on these patients before I just, blindly prescribe them cannabis. We discovered that they actually had some caffeine hidden in some of the drinks that they were consuming, and it hadn't really been discovered. We got rid of the caffeine completely, and I put them on a little bit of CBD, and they didn't need any THC for their sleep in the end. So the first thing is, what can you take away to help someone sleep? It's, insomnia in my mind, if it's idiopathic and there's no primary sleep disorder or sleep apnea or, different sleep things that can be found on a polysomnogram, then it's often a disorder of 24-hour nervous system hyperarousal, and we have to wind these people down, which is where CBD during the day can be really helpful because it can help with the stress response, decrease the cortisol response over time, and people feel less stressed by the end of the day, and then they can wind down easier. That being said, I also have patients who have already tried that, and we use a THC-rich oil starting at 1 to 2 milligrams about an hour before they go to bed. And they find it completely effective for their sleep. And these are people who have failed other sleeping pills like prescription sleep aids from different categories of medications, or they're having a lot of hangover effect in the morning from the prescription sleep aids and they want to try switching, and they have found it much better for them. One of my patients said to me, I feel like I know what it is to sleep normally for the first time in my life. That's after I gave him a small dose of THC oil before bedtime. And he also had depression, and we were quite conservative with his nighttime THC because I didn't want him to feel groggier in the morning because he already had depression. But he actually felt better in the morning after a few weeks of being on the medical cannabis THC oil at nighttime. And then we did a high CBD oil for him during the day. So that was a really interesting case. Okay. We've talked about this a little bit. THC, when it comes to stress and anxiety, really less is more. I'm just going to kind of move back a little bit. Andy says, references for RCTs and anxiety would be very useful. Yes, so on that list I mentioned on my blog in July, I will have a list, a very, very long list of studies. And also in the meantime, if anyone's curious and they just want to do a quick and dirty search, if you go to Google Scholar and you type in AND terms like anxiety and cannabis, anxiety and cannabinoids, anxiety and cannabidiol, and then you can search based on full text, based on abstract alone, based on year published. It's also incredible what you can find. And there's stuff coming out all of the time. Whenever I do this, every few weeks I tend to do this, and there's always new things. So I just want to do a short case study, and then I'll take a few questions. We'll go over a little bit. That's okay with me, if it's okay with you. So this is a patient I saw. It's a very typical patient. I've seen, this is not cherry picked, guys. This is very, very typical. So this was a 60-year-old man, and he had very treatment resistant anxiety and depression for over 20 years. He had tried a lot of different things. He had tried many, many medications. The list you can see before you. He had tried a psychologist visits, different types of psychology interventions, which he said did help a bit, but it wasn't really enough to kind of keep the cost up, which is often a problem with psychotherapy. I'm a huge fan of psychotherapy, combining it with pills and skills, but the cost is often prohibitive for people to maintain it. That's the issue. So he said to me at the first visit, he's like, I'm really just tired and just kind of, I've given up hope on all the medication trials and the side effects and just not being, really beneficial for my condition. So we decided to try him on some medical cannabis. He had never tried cannabis in his life, recreationally or otherwise. And we used a really high CBD oil for during the day. We used a 1-to-1 CBD THC, what was labeled as an indica oil for nighttime. And it had some really calming terpenes in the profile. Some people, if you give them a 1-to-1, meaning it has basically 50% THC, 50% CBD in a ratio. Some of these people, that will wake them up more at nighttime. So it's really person dependent. If that happens to your patient, switch them to, you can do a few things, which I'll get to in a second, what happens when something doesn't work. But one of the things you can do is you can, if it's waking them up more, you can go to a product in a lower dose that's higher in THC. And if you can get a terpenoid profile on that product, even if you have to ask the supplier what they think the dominant terpenes are, sometimes that is helpful. And if they don't know or they can't tell you, sometimes switching products and still using the same amount of THC and CBD makes a difference. So a little bit of this is a bit of detective work, and it's a bit of the art of medicine because these are botanicals. So at his 6-month follow-up, this lovely gentleman had a great reduction in his anxiety and depression symptoms. His sleep was improved. He wasn't really having side effects from the medication. He started doing some hobbies and he started exercising more. He actually lost a bit of weight. And really important, obviously, he started going out with friends. So those are all things that are going to help his depression further, obviously. And those are things he couldn't do before because he was stuck in this cycle of not really being able to activate, not being able to engage socially, not being able to do the things that we know gets the depressed brain out of those spirals. All right. I'm just going to see if there's anything else that I really want to. This is something I do want to mention. So patients sometimes are using, when they come to see me, most of my patients, when they come to see me, have never tried cannabis, but I do have patients who've been self-medicating for years. And sometimes they're referred to me because their doctors have found out about the self-medication and they're concerned that there's a lot of THC use and it might be maybe making some of their mental health conditions worse, but they're not sure. So when we do the intake, the first thing is to see how much THC they're using and how much CBD they're using, like what products are they using from the black market, if they have any idea. And if I think they're overusing THC, like if I have a patient with any anxiety spectrum disorder who is using a ratio of high THC, low CBD, I really do like to switch them because usually it does improve when we increase the CBD and we decrease the THC. So there's a few ways of doing this. If they're not using it every day or very much, you can just have them wash out the THC products completely, or a gentler method if they're quite habituated. And often, obviously I'm screening these people for cannabis use disorder as well. Then we usually swap out the high THC for a lower THC vaporized product, or we mix them together if they're doing a lot of vaporized products. Excuse me. And then we usually add an oral product that's very, very high CBD and low THC to just kind of like shift that ratio. And everyone's a little bit different how quickly this occurs. And, we just work in a care plan together on shifting this over. And often patients are a little bit skeptical of this approach at first, but I've found it's so useful for them. And once they start doing it, their anxiety actually starts to improve and you get the buy-in. Okay, I'm just going to see if there's any other comments. I'm just going to finish and then I'm going to take some more of these comments before we go. Thank you for all the great comments, guys. This has been amazing. So this is not just for anxiety. This is a generic starting plan when I prescribe medicinal cannabis. Of course, generic plans are hard to give for any medication, but people always ask me if I could give them a generic plan, what would it be? What is the safest way to start with somebody? If you're a physician or a nurse practitioner in North America or someone prescribing for the first time. So the first thing that I would do is use an oral product to start with, because it's easier to dose, it's easier to keep track of. You don't get the kind of roller coaster of levels. And use a high CBD, low THC product for the daytime as your base. And then if necessary, if you have a patient with severe chronic pain, which is a whole nother topic, that's a whole seminar in itself, which I'm happy to do. I do a lot of work with chronic pain of different varieties. Then those people often need sleep support and they need nighttime pain support. And that's where your THC comes in real handy. But you really want to start at a tiny, tiny dose, especially if they're naive to THC, and take it about an hour before bed in an oil again. So always use some CBD to buffer the THC, even if you're treating chronic pain. And they just, even if they've had experience with THC and they say, CBD doesn't do anything for me, I still add CBD as well, because it works together. And I do feel like it decreases the amount of THC that I need, that patients need, and the side effect profile. And then for breakthrough or rescue, breakthrough symptoms, rescue care for someone who has migraines that come on very suddenly, for someone who has spasms, painful spasms that come on very suddenly, I will sometimes add an vaporized product on top of the base of the oil to control those. And you can start with a balanced strain, like a 1-to-1 CBD or THC, or even a higher CBD, like 5 parts CBD, 1 part THC, and go from there. Okay. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, someone asked me for evidence. So I don't have the links on this page. That was for, I think that was for Andy. Andy, I don't have the links here, but these are pretty easy to find on Google Scholar and PubMed. I use PubMed. And I will have that list in a few more weeks up on the blog with the actual links to all of the abstracts and the full texts where they're freely available, and I can share them. I'm going to do these in another lecture because pregnancy is something I get asked about all the time. I'm actually pregnant myself at the moment. And since I've been pregnant and been sharing that on social media, people have been asking me, what am I doing? Am I taking CBD? Okay. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you guys so much. And I'm just going to answer a few more questions before we go. So I'm just going to scroll back. Great questions. I'm really sorry I'm not a question and you haven't been answered yet. If it's something that we can do a future clinician physician webinar on, then I will incorporate that feedback and we'll get it going next week. Sorry, next month, once a month. Okay, so let's see. I have a question from a colleague. Can CBD be used safely with low dose naltrexone? Thank you. Hi, Hannah. Yes, it can be, and I've used it with low-dose naltrexone. I don't prescribe low-dose naltrexone. It's not one of my areas of expertise, but I work in the shared care agreement. So usually it would be the prescriber of the naltrexone doing that prescription, and this is how I've done it in the past in Canada, and I'm prescribing the cannabis, and then we work together. And yes, I find it very helpful and useful, and it's safe to do this. Yes. That's a great question, actually. We should do a whole seminar on drug-herb interactions, potentially. I think that would be, well, you guys let me know if you think that'd be useful. Okay, Charlotte has a great question. With regards to patients who are unable to receive medical cannabis prescriptions, what advice would you give a patient who is self-medicating using street-bought cannabis? That is a great question because I am a harm reductionist. So if someone's using street-bought cannabis, ideally, if they have access, this really depends on the person's situation, but if they have access to a cannabis social club where actually lay people, non-medical doctors grow cannabis for people who have medicinal needs, oftentimes those people will be growing in, I'm going to put this back on here now. There we go. often those people will be growing their cannabis for patients in an environment that is quite safe without pesticides, because they're not doing it for a profit. It's kind of like a co-op for cannabis enthusiasts. And these cannabis social clubs do exist here in the UK. There's a lot of really wonderful people who are involved with them, who just have a passion for helping patients who need to access medical cannabis but cannot do so in the legal system currently because of cost. And currently we have at least around 1.5 million people using cannabis, black market cannabis, in the UK for medicinal reasons. So this is a huge market. So some of the cannabis advocacy groups are also great resources for patients who are looking for advocacy. So as far as specific things to look for, ideally, if you're getting it from someone who's providing other street drugs, it's more likely to potentially be contaminated or sprayed with something you don't want. Some people, like Carly Barton, who is a fantastic patient advocate here in the UK, she has a campaign called Carly's Amnesty, where she grows her own cannabis and she helps people sign up to a program where they're not going to be prosecuted by the police for growing a few plants. Growing cannabis is pretty labor intensive. I've actually done legal grow own prescription and like their authorizations in Canada for a few patients who, for many reasons, that was the best option for them, although it's not my first option. And they did really well, but you really do have to have the time and the space to grow it, but you can get greenhouses that you can put in a small area. That's a whole really great topic, actually. I'm just going to go through some of the other ones. Yes, Eduardo, all of these slides are going to stay on YouTube. All of the series I'm doing with drug science will be freely available here indefinitely. So please, hopefully, if it's helpful, please share, and then we can just keep adding to the community each month. I think, Diddy Weldon, hi Diddy, says Cannabis Law Reform is a group in the UK that are on Twitter. I think she is speaking of the fact that this is an advocacy group for patients. So thank you for that. There's so many great groups. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that was helpful. If any burning questions have come to your mind in this lecture, things that I didn't cover, things that I flipped through a slide very quickly in the interest of time, anything that comes to mind in terms of other areas of medical cannabis use, anything from chronic pain to neurological disorders to women's health, pregnancy, drug-herb interaction, when you should not prescribe medical cannabis, how to get started really practically with a medical cannabis prescription. These are all things we can do in the next lecture, and I'll be polling people. You can email Drug Science, you can email me, and get in touch on social media. So the more responses we receive on a certain topic, that will be the topic I choose for the next webinar series on here. So thank you so much for joining me, and hope everyone is safe and well.